Before 2003, Uday Hussein was seen by many as the powerful and privileged son of Saddam Hussein. But behind that image, there was a much darker reality. What he did with women, and why. The answers that came out after the fall of the regime were so disturbing that many people could hardly believe they had been hidden for so long. Uday was born on June 18, 1964 in Baghdad, at a time when Saddam was still rising inside the Ba'ath Party. Just 4 years later, in 1968, the Ba'athists took control of Iraq in a coup, and Saddam quickly became one of the most powerful men behind the scenes. By 1979, he officially became president, and from that point on, Iraq turned into a tightly controlled state where loyalty to Saddam meant survival, and disloyalty could mean prison or death. Uday grew up watching this happen in real time, surrounded by armed guards, intelligence officers, and people who treated his father like a figure no one could question. As a child and teenager, Uday wasn't disciplined in the way most people are. He studied at the University of Baghdad later on, but education was never something that shaped him. What did shape him was power without limits. People around him didn't correct him, they obeyed him. If he acted out, it was ignored. If he demanded something, it was given. Over time, that creates a dangerous mindset. By the late 1970s, when Saddam had full control of Iraq, Uday was already living like someone far above the law. He had access to luxury homes, imported cars, and constant security. More importantly, he had access to people who could carry out his wishes without question. Those who interacted with him during this period often described a personality that was unpredictable and aggressive. He drank heavily, even as a young man, which was unusual in a conservative society like Iraq at the time. Alcohol made his behavior even more unstable. He was known for sudden anger, for making decisions on impulse, and for enjoying the fear he created in others. In 1984, he was only 20 years old when Saddam handed him real authority for the first time. He was placed in charge of the Iraqi Olympic Committee and the National Football Federation. On paper, this looked like a role built around sports, discipline, and national pride. In reality, it became one of the first major spaces where Uday's behavior toward people, especially women connected to athletes, officials, and elite circles, operated under total fear. He didn't step into the job like a manager. He stepped into it like someone who owned the system. Athletes quickly became his first visible targets, but the environment he built around sports also shaped how women around that world were treated and controlled. Access, reputation, and safety all became tied to his approval. Inside the Olympic system, losing a game stopped being just a loss. It became punishment. Teams that failed were taken into a private prison hidden inside the Olympic complex and beaten for poor performance. Uday turned discipline into violence, and violence into routine. He reportedly kept a personal torture scorecard, recording punishments for athletes, as if pain was part of official administration. Fear replaced training. Players described halftime phone calls where he would directly threaten them, screaming that he would cut off their legs or feed them to dogs if they lost. These weren't abstract threats. Athletes knew what happened after bad performances, and they lived with that pressure every time they stepped onto the field. One national player later told people he expected to die young because of what he'd seen under Uday's control. But this same system of fear didn't stay locked inside stadiums or training rooms. It started bleeding into the social world around it. Under Uday, access to him or his environment became dangerous by default. Attention itself could turn into risk. By this time, his behavior outside official roles was already becoming widely feared in Baghdad. In restaurants, nightclubs, or private parties, women who attracted his attention could disappear into his orbit without warning. He built several so-called pleasure palaces, luxury buildings decorated with fountains and erotic artwork, designed to look like private playgrounds for the elite. But behind the surface, multiple accounts describe hidden rooms and controlled spaces where intimidation and abuse took place. Women were often brought into these environments through his guards or social pressure linked to his status. Once inside, the power imbalance was total. Resistance carried consequences. Some accounts describe women being beaten or assaulted by people under his command when they refused or tried to leave. Others describe more extreme situations, including abduction from public spaces and being held against their will inside these private locations. One former aide later described a pattern where women were not only abused, but also controlled through fear beyond the room itself. There are accounts of assaults being recorded and then used as leverage against families, forcing silence through intimidation. This wasn't limited to women. Anyone who crossed him could be targeted. A driver refusing to make way for his convoy could disappear. A disagreement could escalate into violence. At one point, he even shot Saddam's own uncle in the leg during a dispute, showing that even family ties offered no real protection from his temper or authority. By this stage, Uday was no longer just a political figure's son. In Iraq, he had become a symbol of unchecked power. He expanded beyond sports into media control, launching the Babil newspaper and youth television programs that promoted his image and reinforced loyalty. He also played a role in building the Fedayeen Saddam, a paramilitary force used to enforce obedience and intimidation. Despite his growing reputation for violence, Saddam did not fully restrain him. Uday continued living in extreme luxury, driving expensive cars through Baghdad, hosting chaotic parties, and demanding loyalty from everyone in his orbit. His life moved between public influence and private fear, with no boundary between the two. And by 1988, the warning signs that had been building for years finally exploded into something impossible to cover up. During a gathering in Baghdad, Uday Hussein violently attacked and killed Kamel Khana Gigio, a man who had been close to Saddam and trusted inside his inner circle. The attack reportedly happened in front of others, and it wasn't planned in any careful way. It was sudden, emotional, and driven by jealousy and anger. For once, Saddam had to respond. Ignoring it would have made him look weak, especially inside a regime that depended on fear and control. Uday was arrested and then sent into exile, reportedly to Switzerland. On paper, this looked like punishment, but in reality, it was limited and temporary. He wasn't removed from power permanently, and he wasn't treated like an ordinary criminal. Within a short time, only a few months, he was allowed to return to Iraq. Instead of learning restraint, Uday came back with even more confidence in his own untouchable status. He still continued to build personal relationships through marriage, but none of them were stable, and none of them protected the women involved from fear. In 1983, he married Nada, a woman from Saddam's inner political circle. At first, it looked like a powerful match inside Iraq's elite world. They had 2 sons together, but behind closed doors, their relationship was marked by violence and intimidation. After a few years, Nada fled, unable to endure the abuse tied to his behavior. Even within marriage, there was no safety, no separation between public status and private fear. In 1993, Uday entered another marriage, this time an arranged political union with a 13-year-old girl, a niece of Saddam Hussein. The marriage was short and unstable, collapsing in just 3 months. She eventually ran away and accused him of beating her. That incident added to a growing pattern that surrounded him everywhere. Women close to him were not living in relationships, they were living under pressure. Even people working closest to him were not protected from that same environment. One aide later described being beaten on the feet as punishment and being forced to listen on the phone while victims screamed, a form of psychological cruelty tied directly to Uday's personal behavior and control. Fear didn't stay behind closed doors. It extended to anyone within the reach of his authority. By this stage, Uday's treatment of women wasn't separate from his personal life. It was part of it. Marriage, access, and proximity all existed under the same shadow of intimidation and control. In December 1996, that violent life suddenly turned on him. As evening covered Baghdad, his red Porsche was moving through Al-Mansur Street when gunmen opened fire. Around 50 bullets hit the car, 17 of which struck Uday himself. The attack was sudden and overwhelming. He collapsed inside the vehicle, badly wounded, but still alive. He survived, but not unchanged. 2 bullets remained lodged in his spine, leaving him physically crippled. From that moment onward, he walked with difficulty and often appeared in public using a cane or wheelchair even. The man who had once moved through Baghdad with unchecked power was now physically limited, but not stripped of influence. This assassination attempt changed the balance inside Saddam Hussein's family. For years, Saddam had tolerated his son's behavior. Now he began to reconsider trust and succession. Quietly at first, then more openly. Saddam shifted his attention toward Uday's younger brother, Qusay. By the year 2000, that shift became official when Saddam named Qusay as his successor. For Uday, this was not just political rejection. It was personal humiliation. The future he believed was his was taken away. After the shooting, people close to him describe a shift in his behavior. He became more withdrawn in some moments, but even more unstable in others. His cruelty didn't disappear. It became more erratic, sometimes turning outward in violence, sometimes turning inward in frustration and paranoia. Rumors spread about his physical condition and injuries, and some accounts suggested he became deeply sensitive about his masculinity and image. In response, he pushed false narratives about his strength, but those claims were widely dismissed by those who knew the truth. Even as his influence was reduced politically, his private life did not shrink. He still tried to live as he always had, surrounded by luxury and control. Along the Tigris River, he and Qusay hosted extravagant gatherings filled with music, alcohol, and forced attendance by young women brought into their circle. But something had changed. Paranoia grew stronger inside him. He began isolating himself, even going as far as barricading his vehicles inside garages out of fear of threats. At the same time, his relationship with Qusay deteriorated. Once close, the brothers grew distant, each suspicious of the other's influence over Saddam. By the time he reached 39 years old, Uday was no longer the untouchable figure of earlier years. Accounts from that period of time continue to describe a pattern tied to women. Despite injuries and reduced political standing, he was still accused in multiple reports of abducting young women from universities and government-linked environments. These were not isolated rumors, but part of a repeated narrative from journalists and defectors who described a system where women from influential families could be taken under pressure, and where resistance carried serious consequences. One reported case described the daughter of a governor, only 14 years old, taken from a gathering, assaulted, and later released. Stories like this circulated in Baghdad's political and social circles, creating an atmosphere where families of power lived with constant fear of exposure and targeting. By 2002, this fear had spread into everyday life. In Baghdad, women began avoiding certain public spaces, not because of official restrictions, but because of what they feared might happen if they were noticed. His name carried weight in silence, passed through warnings rather than public discussion. Even years later, some who met him described a strange contradiction. A Lebanese beauty queen recalled that he could appear charming in conversation, but behind that surface was a reputation already deeply known across Iraq. By then, his identity was not something people were discovering for the first time. It was something they were already trying to survive. In March 2003, everything that had protected Uday for most of his life began to break apart when the Iraq War started. The invasion, led by the United States and its allies, was aimed directly at removing Saddam Hussein and dismantling the system he'd built over decades. This wasn't like earlier conflicts, where the regime managed to survive and tighten control afterward. This time, the pressure was overwhelming, fast, and constant. Within days, major cities were under attack, government structures were shaken, and the security network that once protected the ruling family began to lose its grip. By early 2003, Baghdad itself was no longer under firm government control. On April 9th, U.S. forces entered the city, and images of Saddam's statue being pulled down became a symbol of the regime's collapse. The intelligence agencies, security forces, and officials who once enforced silence were either gone, hiding, or no longer able to operate the way they had before. This shift is what opened the door for long-hidden stories to come out. Victims, witnesses, and even former insiders started sharing what they'd seen and experienced. Journalists, both local and international, began collecting these accounts, and a clearer picture started forming. What people described wasn't just isolated incidents. It was a pattern that matched across different testimonies, involving abuse of power, forced gatherings, kidnappings, and the constant use of fear to control people. What made these revelations so powerful was not just the content, but the timing. For years, these accounts had existed in private conversations, whispered between trusted individuals. Now they were being spoken openly, recorded, and shared with the world. Former officials who'd once stayed silent out of fear began to admit what they knew. Some described the internal culture of the regime, where questioning someone like Uday was simply not an option. Others explained how the system itself prevented any form of accountability, even when people inside it recognized that something was wrong. As more testimonies came out, the image of Uday that had existed outside Iraq started to change. After that, Uday and Qusay disappeared from public view. With the government gone and coalition forces actively searching for high-ranking members of the regime, they knew they were among the most wanted men in Iraq. Their faces were widely circulated, and they were even included in the U.S. military's most wanted list, which made it extremely difficult to move freely or find safe long-term shelter. In the weeks that followed, they relied on a network of loyalists and former regime supporters to move between safe houses. These locations were meant to provide temporary protection, but the situation was unstable. Many former allies were either hiding, captured, or unwilling to take risks now that the balance of power had shifted. Every move they made carried the risk of being exposed, either through intelligence gathering or betrayal. By July 2003, U.S. forces had intensified their efforts to locate them, using a combination of intelligence sources, surveillance, and tips from individuals on the ground. On July 22nd, acting on specific information, U.S. troops surrounded a house in Mosul, where Uday and Qusay were believed to be hiding. The house belonged to a man who was reportedly connected to them, and the tip that led to its discovery was widely believed to have come from someone seeking a reward or protection. What followed was a prolonged and intense firefight. U.S. forces called for the occupants to surrender, but there was no compliance. Instead, the situation escalated into a battle that lasted several hours. The brothers were heavily armed and resisted from inside the building, using weapons to hold off the troops surrounding them. The U.S. military responded with increasing force, eventually bringing in heavier weapons to end the standoff. By the end of the operation, both Uday and Qusay were dead, along with others who were inside the house. Their deaths marked a sudden and definitive end to their time in power. For many Iraqis, especially those who'd lived in fear of them, it was a moment that confirmed the old system was truly gone. But while their lives ended that day, the effects of their actions didn't disappear with them. For victims, especially women who had been affected by Uday's behavior, the end of his life didn't erase what they'd experienced. The fear, the trauma, and the impact on their lives remained.